September 26, 1974, USSR, Moscow region. Not far from the 43rd kilometer railway platform, Gorebnik was returning home late in the evening. It was already completely dark. He was walking along a narrow path, lighting the way with a bright flashlight. When he looked around, he could only see the silhouettes of tall trees and impenetrable darkness. When he shone the flashlight around once again, he noticed something red in the grass. Curious, he came closer to get a better look. He saw fresh dark red bloodstains that led deeper into the forest. Gorebnik became alert, but he wasn't scared and decided to follow the tracks further. He left the path and, after taking just a few steps, saw that the trail had led him to what he was looking for. He was just a short distance from the bush where the blood trail ended. Shining his flashlight on the bush and examining it, expecting to see some wounded animal, he suddenly saw something long. After a few seconds, he realized he was looking at a person's legs. Gorebnik immediately ran away and called the police. When law enforcement arrived and Gorebnik pointed to the spot, the officers slowly approached the bush. They saw the body of a man with a broken knife sticking out of his back. The man was bleeding out. During this period, the city lived in fear. The police were finding bodies, and the man who was bleeding out, as it turned out later, was 42-year-old Nikolai Demin, who had spent 20 years behind bars. The officers breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, after so much time, they had found the maniac. They thought that the maniac had died at the hands of his own victim, and they didn't know that in reality the real maniac was too smart and cunning. He completely confused the investigation by dressing Nikolai in his own clothes. Overall, in 1974, Moscow was calm. It was a period of stability, or a period of stagnation. Preparations for the 1980 Olympics were already underway then. On television and in the newspapers, there was nothing but positive news. Popular newspapers at the time, such as Pravda and Izvestia, would never report on serial killers so as not to scare the public. Besides, maniacs are a product of the rotten, decaying capitalist West, where people survive in poverty and go insane from unemployment. But in the Soviet Union, where everyone has a roof over their head, free healthcare, and a good job, there is simply no reason for such monsters to exist. But in the fall of 1974, the feeling of safety and calm began to disappear. Suddenly, in the Moscow region and in dark corners of the Taganka district, mutilated bodies started turning up. And sometimes it wasn't just ordinary citizens, but well-known personalities. People like that were protected better than anyone, but it still didn't help. On August 25, 1974, the first victim of the maniac was a 16-year-old schoolgirl, Marina Morozova, who came to the city of Zagorsk to visit her grandmother. Later, the maniac himself described this episode like this: "It was drizzling, it was cold. When it happened, dusk had already fallen. There was greenery and bushes growing around all the houses. I saw a girl at the intersection. She was turning onto that road. She was a pretty girl, attractive. I remembered her appearance well. I followed her for about 200 steps to a private house on the right side. I stopped her by grabbing her sleeve and reached for her bag. She quickly stepped back 3 steps. I stabbed her in the chest. The girl said, 'Are you stupid or what?' She backed away, turned to face the house, and ran through the gate. I stabbed her twice in the right side of her back and saw that after a few steps her legs gave out. She tried to scream, 'Help!' but it came out as a whisper. After that I didn't see anything else. I ran away. I was confused at that moment." August 27th. A 56-year-old man, Gennady Kuzmin, is returning home from work in the evening. He is very tired after his shift since he works as a chef in a restaurant. He is carrying heavy bags with food that was scarce at that time, 2 broiler chickens and a whole 3 kilograms of peaches. In Soviet times, getting something like that was a huge stroke of luck. He was bringing it to his family. He walks through the darkness. There are hardly any people on the street, and in the distance you can only see the faint light of street lamps. He was walking near the Odintsovo railway station. The man put the bags on the ground to take a short rest. He was almost home. He only had to walk down the dark street. But suddenly he heard quick footsteps approaching from behind. Kuzmin had no time to turn around. A sharp blow to his side knocked all the air out of his lungs. At first it seemed to him that he had been punched hard. Only a second later did the sharp, intense pain come. He grabbed at the wound and his legs buckled. The second stab landed in his chest. The maniac moved silently and quickly. He rummaged through the pockets, pulled out a wad of crumpled money, then he picked up the bag of food and took it for himself. He dumped the body into a roadside ditch as if it were useless trash. So far, newspapers wrote nothing about these terrible crimes, and the news said nothing so as not to frighten the Soviet public. Meanwhile, terrible rumors spread across the capital. In store lines and on benches near entrances, people told each other chilling stories about the mysterious Tagansky maniac. In the offices at Petrovka 38, where the leadership of the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department was located, the atmosphere became tense and oppressive. High-ranking police officials understood. If this maniac wasn't caught soon, not only would the life of another citizen be at risk, but their own positions would be in jeopardy. On September 26, near the 43rd kilometer station in the Moscow region, the maniac attacked a man and seriously injured him. During the attack, the maniac's knife broke and the blade remained in the victim's back. The victim in the episode shown at the beginning was 42-year-old Nikolai Demin, who spent about 20 years in prison. Later, forensic experts determined that the blood splatters and stains on the clothing did not match the injuries that Nikolai Demin himself had sustained. However, on the fabric they found washed-out traces of blood belonging to other people. Nikolai closely resembled another person who was actually the real maniac, and when the real maniac realized this, he pulled off an elaborate scheme. The maniac brutally beat Demin, stabbed him, and disfigured his face. He was counting on the police mistaking Nikolai's body for the dead maniac and closing the case. And at first, that's exactly what happened. September 1974. The autumn evening was cold and dark. The wind was blowing dry orange leaves along the park's alleys. After classes, student Volodya Parshin was hurrying home. To save time, he decided to take a shortcut and go through the old dark park. The streetlights there were barely lit, and the grass rustled under his feet. Ahead, he saw the silhouette of a person. A young guy, about his age, was walking toward him. The stranger had a very kind, pleasant face. He looked at Volodya calmly. The guy looked completely harmless, like an ordinary student. As he came closer, the student wasn't scared, but thought that maybe the stranger wanted to ask him something, or ask for a cigarette. They drew level with each other. Suddenly, the guy lunged forward. Volodya felt a strong blow to his chest. It felt like fire had scorched him, but it was a sharp knife. Volodya cried out in shock and tried to cover the wound with his hands. But the stranger acted silently and very quickly. He delivered 3 more powerful blows. The knife easily pierced through the clothes. The excruciating pain stunned the student. His vision darkened, his legs gave way, and he fell heavily onto the damp ground. The maniac acted confidently and quietly. He squatted down and quickly began searching the wounded Volodya. He reached into the pockets, took the wallet with money and the watch. After that he stood up, turned around and calmly walked away into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. Volodya was left lying on the cold ground. He was breathing heavily, wheezing, and fighting for his life with the last of his strength. And he managed to do it. Even after such serious injuries, he survived. October 6, 1974. In the very center of Moscow, in one of the famous nomenklatura buildings where apartments were given only to important people, life went on as usual, calm and measured. The apartments were furnished with imported furniture, and in the drawers you could find expensive jewelry and items. Nina Dolinyan was in one of these apartments. Nina was no ordinary elderly woman. Dolinyan worked as a secretary typist in the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Important documents passed through her hands, and she personally knew some of the country's leaders. Someone knocked quietly on the door. In those years, people opened the door much more willingly. No one expected danger in a guarded house in the center of the capital. And Nina Dolinyan was also confident in her safety and opened the door. She saw a young guy. There was nothing special about him, completely ordinary, unremarkable, dressed in a simple black jacket. But Nina didn't even have time to ask what he wanted before the guy entered the apartment himself. When Nina lowered her gaze, she saw a heavy knife in his hands. Without a word, looking cold and empty, the attacker began stabbing with the knife. The woman tried to shield herself and scream, but lacked the strength. She fell onto the parquet floor, bleeding heavily. After that, the guy didn't even panic. He stepped over the body and started walking around the rooms looking for valuables. With incredible calm, he searched the closets and dressers, turning everything in the house upside down. He took with him gold jewelry, expensive Swiss watches, and rare foreign clothes that you couldn't buy in an ordinary Soviet store. After the theft, he just as quietly left the apartment, carefully closing the door behind him. Nina Dolinyan survived by a miracle because the neighbors heard the noise and called an ambulance. But unfortunately, the injuries were so severe that the doctors fought for her life for a very long time. When the news about the attack on the employee reached the top, an alert was declared at Petrovka 38. The phone of the head of the Moscow police, Major General Kornev, was literally ringing off the hook. He was getting calls from Staraya Ploshchad, from the main party building, and they were demanding immediate reports. They were ordered to find this maniac within 24 hours. The detectives started questioning janitors, passers-by, and checking all known Moscow pickpockets and robbers. But the criminals seemed to have vanished without a trace, leaving no fingerprints, no evidence, and no witnesses who could clearly describe his face. From the composite sketch made from the statements of Dolinyan, who had barely regained consciousness, an utterly ordinary man was looking back, completely unremarkable, and it would be very difficult to find him. She described him like this: a young guy of average height with sideburns and kind eyes with an ordinary haircut. Every other young Muscovite fit that description, and the sideburns could be shaved off. The police hadn't even managed to work through half of the leads in the Dolinyan case when an event occurred in the quiet Moscow suburb of Abramtsevo that shocked the entire creative intelligentsia of the country. Abramtsevo was a legendary place. There were state-owned dachas there, which were given only to the most distinguished people of the USSR. Teachers, actors, artists, and choreographers. The settlement was guarded. There were almost no outsiders, and the locals all knew each other by sight. In October 1974, it was there, in her own country house, that the body of Lydia Kupriyanova was found. This news instantly spread throughout Moscow. The entire capital was in shock. The thing is, Lydia Kupriyanova was the wife of Mikhail Kupriyanov, an outstanding Soviet artist and people's artist of the USSR. He was part of the world-famous trio of cartoonists Kukriniksi. Their posters and drawings were known throughout the country. They were laureates of the Stalin and Lenin prizes, and they were valued by the country's top leadership. And they were much better than the modern rock band Kukriniksi, so by no means should they be confused. Unique jewelry, antique gold ornaments, family heirlooms, and foreign items brought from overseas exhibitions disappeared from the Kupriyanov family's country house. Andrey Yevseyev was born in 1955 in the city of Kodkovo, Moscow region. It was a typical working-class town, where people's lives revolved around a few factories. Andrey Yevseyev's acquaintances noted his ostentatious openness, good-naturedness, and sociability. He seemed like a down-to-earth guy, always ready to lend a hand, but he quickly lost interest in any task he was given and soon became burdened by it. If his help was needed just once, for example, to move furniture during a move, Yevseyev was always willing to help. His drinking buddies also appreciated his lack of greed and his willingness to share. He would readily lend them money and never pressured anyone about paying back debts. In addition, Yevseyev maintained intimate relationships with several women of rather loose morals, and all of them spoke of his generosity and love of giving, but his problems began back in childhood. Andrey did not like studying and did not want to. At school, he constantly clashed with teachers, skipped classes, and got into brutal fights with his peers. As a result, he couldn't even finish 7th grade. His incomplete secondary education certificate kept him from getting into a good school. Yevseyev tried to follow the typical career path of a Soviet citizen. He tried to get jobs as a model, a lab assistant, a passenger train conductor, and even a sailor. But he never stayed at any job for more than 2 or 3 months. Honest physical labor disgusted him. The reason for such laziness and aggression lay partly in his mental health. Yevseyev had serious problems with his head, in scientific terms, issues with his mind. In the early 70s, he was registered at a neuropsychiatric clinic because of his antisocial behavior. Later, he said this: "I left the hospital a complete fool because of all the medications they gave me there. I was in a very painful state with difficulty thinking. I considered people to be my main enemies." He was diagnosed with pathological antisocial behavior. However, Soviet medicine at that time considered him quiet, not dangerous to society, and discharged him home under regular outpatient supervision. The doctors, of course, made a mistake. Inside Andrey, aggression toward the whole world was already growing. Every time Yevseyev came from his grey Kotkovo to the center of Moscow, he was breathless with anger. He walked along the busy metropolitan avenues and watched other people's beautiful lives. He paid attention to the passers-by whose clothes were fashionable and expensive, and he passionately wanted to take them for himself. He wanted to eat well, dress fashionably, and have his pockets full of money. But he didn't have the brains, talent, or patience to earn enough for that kind of life, and in general, it's difficult. You also need luck. And that's when a thought formed in his head. If these people have what I don't, then the world is unfair. If that's the case, I have every right to come and take from them whatever I want. Attacking people was no longer something forbidden or bad for him, but became a real substitute for a regular job. He went to work calmly, without any unnecessary emotions. He didn't have any complicated psychological motives like other famous maniacs. He was simply driven by envy and greed. On October 8, 1974, in the Tagansky district of Moscow, between 7 and 8 in the evening when the streets were filled with people returning from work, Andrey Yevseyev decided to start a bloody massacre. The attacks took place in front of numerous passers-by. Yevseyev acted lightning fast. He would run up to young women, stab them with a knife, snatch their purse, and disappear into the crowd. The brazenness of the crime shocked the investigators. Moscow had never encountered anything so brazen in a crowded city center before. Crowds would instantly gather around. People were in shock. Such things just couldn't happen in the USSR. 2 girls received deep, precise stab wounds. Yevseyev struck to kill, leaving no chance. Both women died right there on the pavement before the ambulance arrived. The 3rd victim miraculously survived, and she helped create a composite sketch. Trying to stop the wave of crimes, the GRU leadership created a special operation, the Administrative Investigative Group. It included the best detectives, forensic experts, and analysts. Experts spent days poring over maps of Moscow and the Moscow region, comparing the timing of the attacks, the nature of the injuries, and lists of stolen items. Kvoshchik. They needed to find a pattern, a clue, some common detail that would connect all these crimes so they could finally catch the criminal. And suddenly, one of the young analysts, while analyzing the crimes, noticed one detail. It seemed to him that several of the victims, both those who died and the one who survived the attack, had at least one red item in their outfit on the day they encountered the criminal. This seemed like a real breakthrough to the detectives. Tired from sleepless nights and intense pressure from above, the investigation leaders immediately seized on this lead. Now the police began to think that there was a maniac operating in the capital who chose his victims solely based on the presence of red in their clothing. They believed that the criminal was driven by a mental disorder that manifested as a pathological hatred of the color red. A large-scale operation began. At major Moscow metro stations such as Taganskaya, Novokuznetskaya, Kurskaya, and Komsomolskaya, dozens of detectives in plain clothes were on duty every day. Their only task was to look for women in flashy red coats or jackets in the crowd and discreetly follow them, waiting for a madman to jump out of the darkness. The girls who heard about this hid their red clothes deep in their closets, changing into grey and plain outfits. For a while, Moscow seemed to lose its colors. On October 15, near Akademicheskaya metro station, Yevseyev committed 2 more attacks on girls 20 minutes apart. One of them died from the injuries she received. The very next day, near Proletarskaya metro station, Yevseyev committed another double attack and one of the victims died. But suddenly the attacks stopped. And the reason was that the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the USSR, on behalf of Minister Nikolai Shchelikov, issued a warning on television. The fear of being exposed turned out to be stronger than the desire to take lives, and the maniac disappeared for almost 2 whole years. He returned to his old ways in November 1976, committing 4 robbery attacks in a month. 2 of them ended in murder. After that, the pressure from the party authorities became simply unbearable. Over time, the number of victims increased, word of the incident spread throughout the city, and the police had no results. After that, the detectives resorted to extreme measures. In order to at least report something and create the appearance of successful work, they started detaining all suspicious people indiscriminately. A young man was swept up in it, a 19-year-old soldier, Sergei Savelyev, who had deserted his military unit on the eve of the first crime. He was brought to the station and interrogated. After hours of intense psychological and possibly even physical pressure, threats, and intimidation, the young man couldn't take it and broke down. He signed the papers and incriminated himself, confessing to the terrible murder of Morozova, which he had never committed. The police leadership breathed a sigh of relief. A triumphant report was sent up the chain. The dangerous maniac had been caught, and Soviet citizens could sleep peacefully. The innocent guy was quickly convicted and sent behind bars. But they didn't realize they had made a terrible mistake. The real maniac, of course, remained at large. Moreover, after hearing rumors that someone had already been convicted for his crime, Andrey Yevseyev received official confirmation of his complete impunity and invulnerability. He stalked his victims in deserted parks, dark alleys, near railway stations, and on suburban train platforms. During interrogations, he would later calmly, without a trace of pity or remorse, admit to killing 9 women and committing nearly 30 brutal robberies. He always acted according to the same pattern: a knife strike, a quick search of pockets and bags, and then he would disappear into the darkness. He took everything valuable from his victims, and this brought him closer to his cherished dream of wealth. By the end of 1976, the situation in Moscow had become simply unbearable. Despite the police reporting the arrest of suspicious individuals, the actual violent crimes continued with alarming regularity. Victims were found in various parts of the city. Fear finally spread beyond Taganka and enveloped the entire capital. Wild and terrifying rumors were circulating among Muscovites. The workday of the head of the Moscow police, the legendary General Vladimir Korneyev, turned into a living hell. Korneyev was considered the best officer, a man with unquestioned authority who had solved hundreds of the most complex crimes. But now he was powerless. Every day began with a call on the government line in his office. On the other end, high-ranking officials from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Central Committee of the CPSU shouted and demanded that the Taganka monster be found immediately. But the general had absolutely nothing except a pile of new corpses. The police were still unsuccessfully trying to find the maniac who hated the color red. The detectives were wasting precious time checking mentally ill people who had once shown an interest in bright clothing, while in reality the maniac didn't care at all about that bright red clothing. He wasn't interested in psychological fetishes. His motive was the pleasure from committing crimes and the desire for money. Andrey Yevseyev attacked women in grey jackets, blue coats, black leather jackets, any woman wearing gold earrings and carrying an expensive handbag. The country's political leadership understood that the security system the Soviet Union was so proud of was simply powerless. As a result, an event occurred that had almost never happened in the history of the Soviet police. Because of the inability to catch a single criminal, the country's top leadership decided to fire everyone. Dozens of chiefs were dismissed. The heads of homicide departments of the GRU, key investigators, chiefs of district police stations, and experienced operatives from OMSR who had been fighting crime for years were all dismissed. The new chiefs understood perfectly well that they didn't just get positions, they received a death sentence for their careers if the maniac wasn't caught soon. The best officers from all over the Soviet Union were urgently brought to Moscow. The finale of this long and bloody 3-year drama unfolded against the backdrop of the pre-New Year bustle at the very end of December 1977. Moscow was going about its usual pre-holiday routine. The streets were covered with fluffy snow, and long noisy lines formed outside the stores for hard-to-find tangerines and Soviet champagne. People hurried to buy gifts for their loved ones, decorated Christmas trees, and made plans for New Year's Eve. The city was completely relaxed and caught up in pleasant holiday preparations. It was this general pre-holiday commotion that led to the downfall of Andrey Yevseyev. After 3 years of a comfortable and completely consequence-free life, he would soon fall into the hands of the police. He had already started to believe that he was smarter than everyone else, that if the best detectives couldn't catch him for so long, then he truly was a genius of the criminal world. But he didn't know yet that he would be found very soon. The witness of the last killing reported that he saw a suspicious man in a corduroy jacket at the crime scene. A jacket with bloodstains was found, and a knife was discovered in its pocket. However, when the suspect Shakhnov was arrested, he stated that the jacket had been given to him by another person. The examination confirmed the truthfulness of Shakhnov's testimony. Another witness said that he saw a stranger on the Kodkova commuter train, and at that time he was wearing a railway worker's uniform. When they checked the database and selected citizens matching the description, the surviving victims identified the criminal as 22-year-old Andrey Yevseyev. On December 28, 1977, the maniac was apprehended. On that day, he decorated the New Year's tree with jewelry stolen from the people he had killed. When they came for him, he hid the jewelry in Yevseyev's apartment as well. Nothing suspicious was found on Yevseyev except for a collar stolen from the last victim. Yevseyev explained that he kept the collar as a memento of his beloved dog. At first he refused to give testimony, but on December 31, the day before New Year's, in a conversation with his cellmate, he let slip a strange phrase, "Majk, you must have already baked pies with jewels." The cellmate turned out to be an informant, and the investigators figured out that the stolen jewels were hidden in a bag of flour. The suspicion was confirmed during the second search of Yevseyev's apartment. The interrogations began. Yevseyev was far from stupid and understood Soviet laws very well. He was well aware that for taking the lives of 9 women, especially since some of them were relatives of high-ranking state officials, the Soviet court would show no mercy. He understood that he might be facing the death penalty, execution by shooting. He had nothing left to lose, and Yevseyev decided to use what he thought was his last proven trump card. He remembered that his medical record already had an old diagnosis, and that he had once been in a psychiatric hospital. The maniac decided to put on a show for the investigators and simulate complete, profound madness. He hoped that he would be declared insane, spared from execution, and sent for treatment in a secure psychiatric hospital for the rest of his days. Right in his cell at Butyrka prison, Yevseyev began to stage wild, absurd scenes. He would roll around on the cement floor for hours, howl, bang his head against the walls, and talk to invisible companions. But the most interesting moment was an incident with food. When he was brought regular food, Yevseyev would demonstratively refuse it, not eating porridge or bread. He would start demanding that they give him salted herring. When his demands were met, the maniac would start behaving very strangely. In front of the detectives and prison doctors, Yevseyev, with a mad gleam in his eyes, would grab the herring with his hands and start eating it whole. He didn't clean it, didn't separate the meat. He chewed the herring along with the head, scales, tail, guts, and sharp bones. Bon appetit, in case anyone is eating right now. With this spectacle, he tried to prove to everyone around him that he was completely insane and had now turned into a wild animal, no longer responsible for his actions. But the times when people turned a blind eye to his oddities were gone forever. To put this case to rest once and for all, the investigation ordered a comprehensive forensic, psychological, and psychiatric evaluation. For this, Yevseyev was taken to the Serbsky Institute. The best professors and luminaries of Soviet medicine worked with him around the clock. They studied his behavior in detail, caught him on minor inconsistencies, and analyzed his every word. Yevseyev failed to deceive the experienced specialists. Soviet psychiatrists quickly realized that he was pretending. They delivered their verdict. Andrey Yevseyev was found to be completely sane. The experts proved that all his actions, from carefully planning the attacks, choosing his victims, hiding evidence, and even pretending to be insane in his cell, were acts of self-preservation. He fully understood what he was doing when he took the lives of defenseless people, and he did it with a clear mind and for his own gain. Overall, Andrey Yevseyev appears to have an antisocial personality with narcissistic traits, but he is sane. The main trait, of course, is envy, and not just as an emotion but as a worldview. For him, someone else's well-being is a personal insult, and he thinks that the world is unfair, which means Andrey has the right to correct this injustice through violence, not to earn, but to take away. At the same time, he passes himself off as the perfect nice guy, open, generous, and ready to help. Such a mask can last for years. Friends, women, and acquaintances only see the mask, which is exactly why he's so hard to see through. Physical labor disgusted Andrey, so committing crimes became a direct substitute for work. Literally, a maniac working as a maniac. He planned everything unemotionally. His violence was cold and instrumental. He didn't even beat his victims to make them suffer, but to get access to their belongings. In his case, the victim is an obstacle, not the goal. Yevseyev's weakness is overconfidence. A long period of impunity convinced him of his own superiority, and that's exactly what led to his mistake. Actually, that's how it is with many maniacs. And I talked about the markers and red flags that can help you recognize people like Andrey Yevseyev on my Telegram channel. The link is below the video. Overall, it's worth repeating that the most dangerous type of criminal, and generally the most common among maniacs, it's not the one who looks like a maniac, but the one whom everyone considers to be one of their own, normal, ordinary, and it's hard to identify him by appearance, speech, or manners. Well, actually you can, but again, that's on Telegram. In the fall of 1978, the trial began. Before the trial, Andrey took good care of himself. He did exercises every morning. The courtroom was closed to the general public. Only the relatives of the deceased and high-ranking police officials were allowed in. Yevseyev sat on the defendant's bench under heavy guard, realizing that there was nothing more he could do and that punishment was inevitable. In court, Andrey showed no remorse for what he had done. He stated that he despised those who work and live from paycheck to paycheck. The trial did not last long, as the collected evidence and the gold and belongings of the victims found in the hiding places left no doubt about his guilt. In 1979, the judge read out the sentence, which came as no surprise to anyone. The death penalty, execution by shooting. Andrey Yevseyev listened to these words in silence, with his head bowed. That same year, the sentence was carried out in the dark cellars of Butyrka prison. And what do you think about this case? Like, dislike, watch other videos, and on Boosty you can probably watch the scariest video on the channel for free, which really can't be published on YouTube. The links are also below the video.